Hello, welcome to Italics, the Italian-American magazine show. I'm your host, Anthony Tamburi. First, I'd like to wish everyone a happy holidays and a happy and healthy 2008. Or, as we say in Italian, buone feste and felice anno nuovo. In order to celebrate the holiday season, we're here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one of the greatest museums in the world, in front of their annual presentation of a beautiful Christmas tree and a Baroque 18th century Neapolitan creche. This traditional display has been attracting New Yorkers and tourists alike throughout the generations. For now, let's take a look at what else is on this month's episode of Italics. First, we'll join Professor Richard Alba for a candid interview about his current research. We'll also get an update on the representation of Italian Americans at CUNY, as well as at other universities nationwide. Then, we'll celebrate the 125th anniversary of the birth of Fiorello LaGuardia, the Little Flower, esteemed former mayor of New York City and U.S. Congressman. Then, for some added holiday spirit, we'll also feature a song by vocalist Cristina Fontanelli from her recent Christmas concert here in New York City. Now, let's go to the Calandra Institute for our conversation with Professor Richard Alba. Hi, we're here with Professor Richard Alba, who is the Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Public Policy at the University of Albany, State University of New York. You're also the director of the Center for Social and Demographic Analysis and the Lewis Mumford Center for Comparative Urban and Regional Research. With all that said, why don't you just give us a couple of minutes on what you do on a daily basis at the University at Albany?
Well, aside from my teaching responsibilities, I do research on immigration in the area of urban studies and in other domains, so I keep busy.
You're the author of 7 or more books.
Well, there are a few more coming out.
I noticed that on your Vita, close to 100 articles and book chapters. In looking at your most recent research, where would you say we find the Italian Americans? Because for well over 20-some-odd years, Italian Americans have been part and parcel of your research.
As you know, I've written for a long time about the assimilation of Italians. And I still think that that is the kind of master pattern among Italian Americans. Now, granted, there are plenty of Italian Americans who resist assimilation in a variety of ways. I certainly recognize that. But they have to do so, if you will, in a kind of social and cultural landscape that's really been kind of reconfigured by the mass upward mobility and assimilation of Italian Americans. And, you know, there are many statistical indicators of this, and I don't think that's changing. I think that there are still problems for Italian Americans in entering some elite spheres of American society. Now, if this were a decade ago, I would have said politics is an example of that. And in New York State, a decade ago, we had the example of Geraldine Ferraro, who was aspiring to a New York Senate seat, but was ultimately defeated, in my view, by the deployment of stereotypes about Italian Americans, about mafia linkages that were alleged. Now I have to say, with the rise of Rudy Giuliani to frontrunner status in the Republican competition for a nomination, and Tom Tancredo as a second Italian American in the presidential sweepstakes, I think Italians have broken through, in fact, in the political domain. I do think that in some areas, some elite spheres where there is a premium put on intellectual accomplishment, that Italians, through a variety of stereotypes, are still denigrated. And so that's kind of the point of my article about diversity's blind spot, is that when one looks at the academic world, a world I know very well, I'm still astonished at how few Italian Americans have risen to prominence in different fields. For example, looking at top departments of history, which ought to be a natural field for Italian Americans to appear in. I mean, after all, there's tremendous historical interest in immigration. There should be interest in the history of the Catholic Church, a subject that Italian Americans are interested in. I find no Italian Americans in top departments, and that is really astonishing.
One of your most recent, if not your most recent book published, is called Remaking the American Mainstream, Assimilation and Contemporary Immigration. So I guess the question is, well, is assimilation dead, or is assimilation actually overpowering?
Well, I think assimilation is pretty overpowering. But when we look at elite spheres, there's a different set of dynamics that come into play, because There are groups that take those spheres as, if you will, their kind of traditional privileged turf, and they defend that turf against newcomers. There are various kinds of intellectually acceptable stereotypes about Italian Americans that effectively denigrate their abilities and play down, the worthiness of a subject like Italian American studies. That's on the one side. But I think on the other side, an aspect of the Italian American pattern of assimilation is that that many young Italian Americans who see themselves as kind of moving upward also see themselves as moving outward and moving away from, in a very deliberate sort of way, moving away from their Italian American roots, and particularly when they have intellectual interests. And so therefore there isn't the same kind of collective intensity about Italian American studies as there might be in the case of some other groups like, let's say, Jewish studies, right?
African American studies.
African American studies, exactly.
Yeah, and so I guess the question is, what do we have to do? What can we do, we Italian Americans?
Well, I think that Italian American history and experience should be interesting to anyone who wants to understand larger ethnic and racial patterns in the United States. So my view is that rather than sort of focus on this as something that should be of interest to Italian Americans wanting to discover their roots, in fact, we should expand. And we should say, this is a subject that is really important for anyone who wants to study sort of paradigms of entry into American society. The Italian American experience is a very important example of how a group that, as we know, came, was very humble, kind of entered American society on its lowest levels, had very high levels of illiteracy, very low educational attainment in the second generation, all sorts of problems of adjustment.
Working against, right.
Right, working against, and yet made it. And I think that, we're in a new era of immigration. There's still plenty of groups that are coming in at the bottom. And we should understand something about how Italian Americans were able to forge ahead in order to provide sort of guideposts, if you will, to the members of the new groups who are trying to forge ahead. So I think that there's a very important kind of connection still to be made between the past European American kind of experience of ascent and eventual assimilation and what could happen with newer groups.
In that sense, for those of us who might be interested in Italian American studies at the graduate level, we should probably see it as part and parcel of within a larger context.
That's what I would argue,
yeah.
Yes.
And
but it seems to me that what one wants also people to recognize is that in an experience like this, it's not sufficient to have people looking at it from the outside only. You also need to have the perspective of insiders to that experience in order to get the kind of full picture. And I think that, for example, in the sociology of Italian Americans, which was very prominent in the middle of the 20th century,
yes,
but has kind of almost disappeared today. That it was a problem that it was mainly being conducted by outsiders, and that the insiders' voices were not.
Then why don't you mention a few names? You're talking about Gans.
Well, I'm talking about Herbert Gans, William Foote White.
Right.
These are the two
Foote
most
White.
prominent
Right.
examples.
Exactly.
They wrote two books that are still today regarded as absolute classics.
Canon.
Yeah, you can't get any more classical than these two books.
Yeah.
And yet they didn't give rise to what they should have given rise to, which was a succession then of studies that sort of followed this group over time and tracked how it came to be part of the American mainstream, which it has come to be a part of.